Welcome to our 30 must-know hard question session for the BCBA exam. These items are hard because the answer choices differ in evidence, function, measurement, ethics, design logic, or implementation fit, not because the sentences should be difficult to decode. We will first make each situation clear, then find the decisive clue, apply the relation that clue establishes, and eliminate the option that only almost fits. If you want a timed baseline before or after the lesson, our free mock exam is available at bcbamockexam.com. Before question 1, set up a 4-move routine. First, translate the stem into 3 plain parts. Who is involved, what changed, and what decision is being asked. Second, identify the evidence that changes the decision, a consequence, measurement rule, design feature, safety constraint, or implementation barrier. Third, name the relation instead of matching keywords. Fourth, test the closest distractor by asking what extra fact it would need. On the explanation pages, the lower visual maps that reasoning and shows why the evidence leads to one rule and away from the alternatives. We begin with the scientific posture behind every later decision. The team gives us a label, but the BCBA makes 2 separate scientific moves. The first move is to measure before concluding. The second is to change the conclusion when better replicated data appear. Question 1. A team labels task refusal as random oppositionality. The BCBA does not accept the label as an explanation. First, the BCBA defines and measures refusal across task conditions. An escape hypothesis seems likely at first, but replicated data later point to attention. Which 2 scientific attitudes are shown in order? A. Empiricism first, philosophic doubt when the initial hypothesis is revised. B. Determinism first, parsimony when the initial hypothesis is revised. C. Philosophic doubt first, empiricism only after an intervention succeeds. D. Pragmatism first, determinism when the attention pattern replicates. Keep the 2 moments in order. First, ask how evidence is gathered. Then ask what happens when better evidence contradicts the first explanation. Take a moment to choose from the 4 options on screen. The ordered scientific decisions make the answer. Empiricism first, philosophic doubt when the initial hypothesis is revised. The first decision substitutes objective measurement for a label. The second keeps a scientific conclusion tentative when replicated evidence conflicts with it. Direct observation and measurement demonstrate empiricism. Revising a favored explanation in response to better evidence demonstrates philosophic doubt. The lower visual makes that sequence explicit. Measure directly, revise the hypothesis, and let the better evidence win. B. Determinism supports searching for lawful variables, but revising a contradicted hypothesis is not specifically parsimony. C. Withholding judgment may involve doubt, but the first named action is direct measurement. Empiricism is present before intervention. D. Pragmatism concerns useful prediction and influence, while replicated data do not by themselves turn hypothesis revision into determinism. Separate the attitude used to gather evidence from the attitude used to keep conclusions revisable. Once measurement replaces a label, the next trap is adding causes we have not measured. Both explanations appear equally useful, but only one stays with a relation that was actually measured. The decision is whether an extra inferred cause adds enough value to deserve priority. Question 2. 2 explanations fit the same writing avoidance pattern and predict the same outcome. One explanation uses the measure relation between writing and breaks. The other adds an unmeasured low-achievement personality. Neither explanation has an advantage in feasibility or expected benefit. Why should the BCBA test the task? Break explanation first. A. Selectionism, because a consequence-based history makes inferred variables impossible. B. Philosophic doubt, because both accounts must be treated as equally likely until one is disproved. C. Parsimony, because the measured relation is adequate without adding another assumed cause. D. Pragmatism, because the account linked to the easiest staff action should be tested first. Compare the explanatory work done by each account and notice which one adds an inferred cause without improving prediction or feasibility. Pause on the choices and commit to the best supported answer. Because the extra inner cause adds no explanatory gain, select C. Parsimony, because the measured relation is adequate without adding another assumed cause. The accounts have equal stated prediction, feasibility, and expected benefit. Only one requires an additional inferred cause beyond the measure relation. Parsimony favors testing the simplest adequate account before adding unnecessary constructs. The simpler account remains provisional and should change if later evidence favors another explanation. In the parsimony filter, the measured task-to-break relation survives while the inferred personality cause is removed as an extra assumption. A. Selectionism may explain history, but it does not make private or inferred events impossible or decide the stated testing order. B. Philosophic doubt keeps conclusions revisable. It does not require equal weighting when one account adds an unnecessary assumption. D. Ease of staff action could matter pragmatically, but the STEM explicitly provides no feasibility or benefit difference. Prefer a measured environmental relation that explains the behavior before adding an unmeasured inner cause. Now we move from scientific explanation to the function of antecedent events. We know the salty food changed the current value of water. We do not know the learning history of the blue light, so the question asks us to separate a supported value effect from an unsupported stimulus function claim. Question 3. After eating salty pretzels, a learner presses a water button more often when a blue light is on. The pretzels may have increased the value of water. However, the record gives no history showing what the blue light has signaled or how it was trained. What conclusion can the BCBA make? A. The pretzels establish water's value. An increased pressing proves the light is an SD. B. The pretzels are an SD, while the light must be a conditioned motivating operation. C. The pretzels establish water's value. The light's function requires its learning and contingency history. D. The pretzels establish water's value, and the light is a conditioned reinforcer because it accompanies responding. Separate what changed the value of water from what the blue light has historically signaled. Temporal proximity alone cannot supply that history. Use that distinction to make your choice before the reveal. The missing learning history makes C the only warranted choice. The pretzels establish water's value. The light's function requires its learning and contingency history. Salty food supports a value-altering effect, but response change in the light's presence does not identify what relation the light has historically signaled or altered. The pretzels can establish water as more valuable. Classifying the light as an SD, motivating operation, or other stimulus requires evidence about its conditioning and the response. Reinforcer contingency. The diagram shows the known relation on the left. Salty food raises water value. A. Higher responding in the light is compatible with SD control, but differential availability history is not provided, so the classification is not proved. B. Salty food changes water's current value rather than signaling a button contingency, and the light's MO history is not established. D. A stimulus that accompanies responding is not thereby a conditioned reinforcer. A reinforcing effect requires a consequence relation. Topography and temporal presence do not define stimulus function. Identify the value-altering or availability signaling history. The next item contains two contingencies inside one treatment package. There are two responses and two different outcomes. The request now produces escape, while problem behavior no longer does, so each relation must be classified separately. Question 4. At baseline, both problem behavior and saying "break please" sometimes pause work. During treatment, saying "break please" always produces a 2-minute break. Problem behavior no longer delays or removes the demand. Requests increase and problem behavior decreases. How should the two response consequence relations be classified? A. Both changes show negative reinforcement because both responses occur in the presence of demands. B. The request contacts negative reinforcement. Problem behavior contacts escape extinction. C. Escape extinction directly reinforces the request, while demand removal punishes problem behavior. D. The request is positively reinforced by access to a break, while problem behavior contacts negative punishment. Do not classify the package from its name. Trace what follows the request and what follows problem behavior. Now select the option that fits every part of the stem. Tracing both response-consequence relations leads to B. The request contacts negative reinforcement. Problem behavior contacts escape extinction. The same package arranges different consequences for two response classes. Demand removal follows the request, but no longer follows problem behavior. Removal of demands strengthens the request, which is negative reinforcement. Continuing the demand after problem behavior withholds the previously produced escape consequence, which is escape extinction. The two horizontal tracks prevent us from collapsing the relations. A. Demand context alone does not make both relations reinforcement. Problem behavior no longer produces the prior escape consequence. C. Extinction does not directly reinforce the request, and demand removal follows the request rather than problem behavior. D. A break removes demands rather than adding a stimulus, and withholding escape is extinction rather than negative punishment. Classify each response, consequence relation separately when one treatment package contains reinforcement and extinction. From consequences, we turn to a case where several antecedent sources may control the same performance. Focus on what happened before the very first correct response. Both a written rule and a modeled example were present. Feedback came later and therefore cannot be the only source of the initial performance. Question 5. Before the first teaching trial, a new technician reads the instruction, "Wait 5 seconds before prompting." The technician also watches a supervisor model the delay. The technician waits correctly on the first trial before receiving any feedback. Later feedback improves the timing. What best explains the initial correct performance? A. Rule and model control may both contribute initially. Later feedback can shape performance further. B. Pure imitation, because a model delay rules out control by the written statement. C. Pure rule control, because accurate first trial performance rules out control by the observed model. D. Contingency-shaped behavior from the start, because all correct behavior must contact direct consequences. Ask what was present before the very first correct response. Later feedback cannot explain how that first response was acquired. Choose the answer that requires the fewest unsupported assumptions. Because the first response has two plausible antecedent sources, choose A. Rule and model control may both contribute initially. Later feedback can shape performance further. Two plausible antecedent sources, the written rule and modeled performance, occur before the first response, so the stem cannot isolate a pure source. Initial performance may be multiplied controlled by the rule and model. Later direct consequences can refine or maintain it without proving that they established the first response. The control source's visual sends the written rule and observed model into the first response together. B. Model control can contribute, but the explicit written statement also specifies the response and cannot be excluded. C. A rule can contribute, but the observed model remains a viable source of control and cannot be excluded by first trial accuracy. D. Later feedback can shape performance, but it occurs after the initial response and cannot explain that response's acquisition. When rule, model, and consequences all occur, do not claim pure control without a comparison that isolates them. Multiple control becomes even clearer when verbal and nonverbal antecedents converge. Neither source works reliably alone. Together, the verbal question narrows the response class, and the picture selects the specific answer. So the issue is how two antecedent sources combine. Question 6. During probe trials, a learner sees either a bat or an owl while hearing, "Which animal flies at night?" The question alone produces several night animal names. Each picture alone produces inconsistent labels. When the question and picture occur together, the learner says bat for the bat and owl for the owl. What best explains these stronger, picture-specific responses. A. Pure tacting under conditional control. The question selects a visual feature but contributes no intraverbal strength. B. Convergent multiple control. The picture and verbal question each contribute control to the same response on a trial. C. Divergent multiple control. Because the question evokes several names, the combined trial must be classified as divergent. D. Formal echoic control. The animal name is strengthened because the spoken question contains related verbal content. Decide whether the two antecedents evoke different responses or add strength to the same picture-specific response. Hold on to the decisive clue as you select your answer. The converging verbal and picture control supports B. Convergent multiple control. The picture and verbal question each contribute control to the same response on a trial. The verbal question narrows the relevant class. The picture specifies the animal, and the two sources together strengthen one picture-specific response. The nonverbal picture and the verbal question both contribute to the response emitted on that trial. Conditional selection may also be present, but the question alone and picture alone probes rule out, treating the response as a pure tact controlled by only one source. The convergence graphic places picture and verbal question on separate inputs that meet at one response. A. The question alone probes show that verbal antecedents contribute intraverbal strength. They are not merely selecting a visual feature. C. The question may evoke multiple candidates by itself, but the analyzed combined trial contains two sources converging on one response. D. Related meaning does not establish the point-to-point correspondence and formal similarity required for echoic control. When verbal and nonverbal antecedents each add strength to the same response. Analyze convergent control even if conditional selection also occurs. With stimulus control established, the next set asks how to measure behavior for the decision at hand. Frequency varies, and episode length varies even more. Because the team cares about all instruction lost across the session, the measure must add the time occupied by every episode. Question 7. Across equal-length sessions, crying occurs between 1 and 6 times. Some episodes last only seconds, while others last as long as 15 minutes. The team wants to know the total amount of instruction lost to crying, not the length of a typical episode. Which primary measure best answers that question? A. Total duration per session, because the decision concerns cumulative instructional time lost. B. Mean duration per episode, because typical episode length summarizes the severity of each occurrence. C. Rate per instructional hour, because opportunity time should be standardized. D. Whole interval percentage, because it estimates sustained crying across instruction. The school wants cumulative instruction lost, so choose the dimension that captures all unavailable time rather than only the number of episodes. Take a moment to choose from the 4 options on screen. Cumulative time lost makes it the matching measure, total duration per session, because the decision concerns cumulative instructional time lost. Both episode count and episode length vary, and the decision concerns cumulative instruction unavailable across the session. Total duration aggregates all crying time in the session and directly represents cumulative instruction unavailable when both count and episode length vary. The timeline uses bars of different lengths and then sums every episode. B. Mean duration describes a typical episode but can stay unchanged while cumulative lost time changes with episode count. C. Rate standardizes how often crying begins but does not incorporate the large variation in episode length. D. Whole interval recording can estimate sustained occurrence, but direct total duration is closer to actual time lost. Select the dimension that matches the decision, not the measure that is easiest to collect. The next measurement question is easier once we name the estimand before discussing bias. The target quantity is intervals with any occurrence, not total duration. Once that distinction is clear, the recording rule should match the stated outcome directly. Question 8. The team wants the percentage of 30-second intervals that contain at least one brief out-of-seat response. They do not want the percentage of total time spent out of seat. Staff watch continuously but record only one code for each interval. Which recording procedure and interpretation best match that goal? A. Partial interval recording. It directly scores the stated outcome but cannot be interpreted as percentage of time engaged. B. Momentary time sampling. It estimates intervals with any occurrence when samples are evenly spaced. C. Partial interval recording. It overestimates the stated percentage because brief responses count. D. Whole interval recording. It directly estimates intervals with any occurrence but understates response duration. The target is not the proportion of time engaged. It is the number of intervals containing at least one occurrence. Pause on the choices and commit to the best supported answer. Because the estimand is any occurrence by interval, a FITS, partial interval recording, it directly scores the stated outcome, but cannot be interpreted as percentage of time engaged. The estimand itself is whether any occurrence happened in each interval, which is exactly the partial interval scoring rule. Partial interval recording directly measures the percentage of intervals with at least one occurrence. Bias arises only if that result is misinterpreted as percentage of time engaged. In the interval grid, for cells are checked because any occurrence counts. B. A momentary sample scores behavior only at the observation instant and can miss occurrences elsewhere in the interval. C. Counting a brief occurrence does not overestimate the percentage of intervals containing an occurrence. It only overstates duration if misinterpreted. D. Whole interval scoring requires behavior throughout the interval, so it does not match in any occurrence outcome. Name the estimand before naming interval bias. Partial interval is direct for any occurrence intervals, not for duration proportion. Measurement quality also depends on choosing an agreement calculation that fits prevalence. Most trials are joint non-occurrences, and those easy agreements could hide the problem. The calculation, therefore, needs to focus on trials where at least one observer recorded the rare correct response. Question 9. A learner responds correctly on only 3 of 50 trials. The BCBA worries that the many trials scored incorrect by both observers will make overall agreement look high, even if the observers disagree about the rare correct responses. Which agreement calculation best addresses that concern? A. Trial-by-trial agreement using all 50 correct and incorrect codes. B. Score trial agreement using trials where either observer recorded a correct response. C. Unscored trial agreement using trials where either observer recorded an incorrect response. D. Total count agreement comparing only the observer's session totals. Correct responses are rare, so focus the calculation on the few trials where either observer scored a correct rather than letting abundant double-zero trials dominate. Use that distinction to make your choice before the reveal. Rare correct responses point to B. Score trial agreement using trials where either observer recorded a correct response. Correct responses are rare, and the stated concern is inflation from the large number of jointly unscored trials. Score trial agreement restricts the comparison to trials on which at least one observer scored the rare event, making disagreement about correct responses visible. The agreement lens literally zooms in on the rare checked trials. A. Trial-by-trial agreement preserves location, but can be inflated by the many trials both observers score incorrect. C. Unscored trial agreement is most sensitive when non-occurrence is rare, the opposite prevalence pattern. D. Session totals can agree even when observers identify different trials as correct. Use scored agreement for rare occurrence and unscored agreement for rare non-occurrence. Prevalence determines which agreements can inflate the total. Reliable measurement still has to be interpreted across more than one graph feature. 2 graph features matter at the same time. There's a strong immediate level drop, followed by a worsening treatment trend. A complete answer must acknowledge both. Question 10. When intervention begins, aggression drops immediately from 8 to 10 episodes to 3 episodes per session. During the next 6 sessions, however, aggression rises steadily from 3 to 7 episodes. Which interpretation best describes the full pattern? A. The effect is strong because the immediate level reduction and limited overlap outweigh the later trend. B. There is no effect because the final treatment point approaches baseline, so the initial level change is irrelevant. C. There is an immediate level change, but the worsening treatment trend weakens confidence in a durable effect. D. The effect is stable because mean treatment level is lower. Trend matters only when baseline also trends. Hold the immediate level change and the later trend in mind at the same time. Now select the option that fits every part of the stem. Reading level and trend together supports C. There is an immediate level change, but the worsening treatment trend weakens confidence in a durable effect. The data show two different features, a promising immediate drop and a subsequent trend back toward baseline levels. The immediate level change is meaningful, but the increasing treatment trend suggests deterioration. Both features must be interpreted before claiming stable effectiveness. The graph reading strip compresses the pattern into two moves, a favorable level drop followed by an unfavorable rising trend. A. The immediate reduction is real, but a sustained countertherapeutic trend directly threatens durability and cannot be outweighed by the first point alone. B. The late deterioration matters, but it does not erase the observed immediate level change. The defensible interpretation must describe both. D. A lower mean can coexist with systematic deterioration, and treatment trend is relevant even when baseline is flat. Read level, trend, variability, overlap, and immediacy together. Do not let one attractive feature decide the graph. We now move from reading a graph to selecting a design that can support a causal conclusion. Withdrawal is unsafe, so the design needs staggered introduction. The key comparison is between settings that may change together and response chains that are expected to remain independent. Question 11. A safety package for dangerous elopement cannot be withdrawn once it begins. The team could stagger treatment across 3 settings, but staff expect rapid generalization from one setting to the others. The team also has 3 safety response chains with stable baselines that are unlikely to change together before training. Which design choice gives the strongest staggered demonstration? A. Multiple baseline across settings because any 3 settings automatically form independent tiers. B. Changing criterion across settings because generalization strengthens stepwise control. C. Multiple baseline across the independent safety response chains rather than the settings. D. A multi-element comparison of package and no package conditions within every response chain. Choose tiers that can remain stable while another tier changes. Expected generalization can destroy that independence. Choose the answer that requires the fewest unsupported assumptions. Tier independence makes C the defensible design. Multiple baseline across the independent safety response chains rather than the settings. Staggered tiers must be sufficiently independent. Expected cross-setting generalization threatens the setting tiers, while the response chains are described as stable and independent. A multiple baseline across the independent response chains preserves staggered replication without withdrawing the package and avoids the stronger generalization threat across settings. The design map shows 3 chains receiving intervention at different points. A. The number of tiers is not enough. Predicted generalization can cause untreated setting tiers to change before intervention. B. Changing criterion requires stepwise quantitative performance criteria, not different settings that may generalize together. D. Rapid no-package alternation creates the withdrawal risk the stem prohibits and does not solve tier dependence. For multiple baseline, choose tiers that can remain stable while other tiers receive intervention. Convenience is not independence. Another design threat appears when procedures alternate in a fixed sequence. The higher responding during Y may be a procedure effect, but Y also always comes second. The next step must separate the treatment variable from fixed order and carryover. Question 12. A BCBA compares 2 prompting procedures within each session and uses a different card for each procedure. Procedure X always comes first, and responding is consistently higher during procedure Y. What change would best show that the procedure itself, rather than order or carryover, caused the difference? A. Withdraw both procedures after improvement and wait for responding to reverse. B. Raise the performance criterion gradually while keeping X first. C. Introduce the comparison at different times across participants, but keep the same order. D. Counterbalance condition order, retain discriminable cues, and examine whether the difference replicates. Before crediting X or Y, ask whether the same difference would remain if the order were reversed or counterbalanced. Hold onto the decisive clue as you select your answer. The uncontrolled sequence makes D the appropriate conclusion. Counterbalance condition order, retain discriminable cues, and examine whether the difference replicates. Because X always precedes Y, sequence and carryover are plausible rival explanations for the observed difference. Counterbalancing order while preserving discriminable conditions tests whether the difference survives changes in sequence, strengthening the multi-element comparison. The order control graphic places X to Y beside Y to X. A global withdrawal does not separate the two procedures or test the identified order effect. B. Changing the criterion does not control the fact that X always precedes Y. C. Staggering the same fixed-order comparison across participants can replicate the order confound. In an alternating comparison, control order and carry over before attributing a difference to the procedures. The next domain changes the sequence of reasoning because immediate risk and professional competence come first. This is not merely a scheduling decision. Weight loss, possible swallowing difficulty, and lack of specialized competence place safety and qualified coordination ahead of independent treatment. Question 13. A BCBA has no training in pediatric feeding. The BCBA is asked to treat food refusal for a child who is losing weight and may have difficulty swallowing. The family wants treatment to start tomorrow. What should the BCBA do first? A. Collect low-risk mealtime data first and defer medical coordination until a stable behavioral pattern emerges. B. Protect safety, coordinate medical evaluation, and seek qualified consultation or referral. C. Obtain medical clearance, then independently use a familiar escape protocol while developing feeding competence. D. Transfer the case entirely to medical providers and avoid behavioral assessment until all medical causes are excluded. Identify what must happen now for safety, then what requires expertise outside the BCBA's current competence. Take a moment to choose from the 4 options on screen. Safety and competence place be first. Protect safety, coordinate medical evaluation, and seek qualified consultation or referral. The case includes possible medical risk and requires expertise the BCBA does not possess. The safest ethical sequence is to protect the client, stay within competence, coordinate needed medical evaluation, and obtain qualified support or refer rather than independently implementing treatment. The risk triage pyramid orders the response. Protect safety at the base, coordinate medical needs next, and consult or refer as required. A. Low-risk data may be useful, but weight loss and possible swallowing difficulty make delayed medical coordination unsafe. C. Medical clearance does not create specialized behavioral competence or make independent feeding treatment appropriate. D. Medical coordination is necessary, but behavioral assessment and referral planning need not wait for every possible medical cause to be excluded. Risk first, competence second, then consultation, coordination, documentation, and referral as the case requires. From competence, we turn to effective consent, withdrawal, and recognizable public material. The withdrawal process is already complete, so the legal or organizational form of withdrawal is no longer in dispute. The decision is whether recognizable material should still be used when a non-identifying alternative works. Question 14. A capable adult client previously gave informed consent for a BCBA to use a recognizable graph and video in professional teaching. Before a new public workshop, the client completes the applicable withdrawal process, and the BCBA confirms that consent is no longer in effect. The same lesson can be taught with de-identified examples. What should the BCBA do? A. Use the recognizable materials once more because they were created while consent was active. B. Remove the client's name from the graph, but use the recognizable video because it was recorded under valid consent. C. Honor the effective withdrawal, remove recognizable material, and teach with de-identified examples. D. Ask the caregiver to provide new permission and restrict the workshop to professionals before using the original materials. The applicable withdrawal process is complete, consent is no longer in effect, and the teaching goal can be met without recognizable material. Pause on the choices and commit to the best supported answer. Current withdrawal plus a workable de-identified alternative support. C. Honor the effective withdrawal, remove recognizable material, and teach with de-identified examples. The capable adult has completed the applicable withdrawal process. The withdrawal is effective, the material remains recognizable, and de-identified examples fully meet the teaching purpose. The BCBA should respect the effective withdrawal and protect confidentiality. De-identified examples preserve the teaching purpose without using recognizable client material after consent is no longer in effect. The disclosure gate places effective withdrawal before the new public use. A. Prior consent does not authorize a new public use after the applicable withdrawal has become effective. B. Removing a name does not make a recognizable video non-identifiable, and effective consent is no longer in place. D. Caregiver permission does not replace the capable adult client's decision or reactivate the withdrawn consent. Once an applicable withdrawal is effective, stop new recognizable public use and use a non-identifying alternative when it meets the purpose. Authorization is not the end of ethical decision-making. Moment-to-moment assent and refusal still matter. Representative consent started the program, but the client is now clearly refusing after the product changed. With no urgent risk requiring completion, the immediate decision is how to respond to that refusal. Question 15. A representative consented to a toothbrushing program for an adult who cannot provide legal informed consent. The client used to accept unflavored toothpaste. When mint toothpaste is introduced, the client pushes it away, says stop, and moves toward the door. There is no urgent health reason to finish the trial. What should the BCBA do first? A. Reduce prompt intensity and complete the current brushing step before evaluating product preference. B. Pause, honor the refusal, assess the product change, and collaborate on an acceptable next step. C. End the session and suspend the entire hygiene goal until the representative reconfirms consent. D. Continue the established program because representative consent and hygiene benefit outweigh product preference. Notice the changed product, the clear refusal, the available alternative, and the absence of urgent risk. Use that distinction to make your choice before the reveal. The clear refusal and change product make be the immediate response. Pause, honor the refusal, assess the product change, and collaborate on an acceptable next step. The refusal is clear. The change product is a plausible variable. A previously accepted alternative exists, and there is no urgent reason to override the pause. Pausing respects the client's communication while allowing assessment of the mint product and collaborative adaptation of a socially important goal. The decision path follows the actual sequence. Clear refusal, pause, check what changed, then offer an accepted option. A. Lower prompting may reduce intrusiveness, but completing the steps still overrides clear refusal before assessing the newly changed product. C. A pause is appropriate, but suspending the entire goal ignores the previously accepted alternative and skips collaborative adaptation. D. Representative authorization and health value matter, but neither makes moment-to-moment refusal or a feasible accommodation irrelevant. Consent establishes authorization. Ongoing assent, refusal, dignity, risk, and context still guide moment-to-moment practice. We are halfway through. Notice the pattern in the first 15 questions. A label never outranks a measured relation, and a generally good practice never outranks the specific decision in the stem. In the second half, assessment, treatment, goals, integrity, and supervision add another layer. Context can change which technically reasonable action is best. If one domain is exposing a weak spot, our quick study guide can help rebuild the underlying distinction before you retest it. The final ethics item asks what to do when avoiding an overlapping relationship would itself reduce access. The overlap creates a real boundary risk, but immediate termination would also create a serious access problem. The question asks for documented safeguards and a feasible eventual resolution plan, not denial of the overlap or an automatic exit. Question 16. In a remote community, the only qualified BCBA serves on the same small nonprofit board as a client's parent. Ending the board role or ending services would substantially reduce access to needed care. How should the BCBA handle this unavoidable overlap? A. Disclose the overlap only if a concrete conflict later affects services, while continuing both roles unchanged. B. Document safeguards and monitoring now, and plan to resolve the overlap when continuity of care can be protected. C. Continue both roles, recuse from board votes involving the parent, and rely on an informal verbal agreement. D. Transfer services immediately even if no qualified provider is available during the transition. Balance the foreseeable boundary risk against access to care, then choose active safeguards rather than denial or reflexive termination. Now select the option that fits every part of the stem. Active risk management makes B the balanced answer. Document safeguards and monitoring now, and plan to resolve the overlap when continuity of care can be protected. The overlap may be difficult to avoid, but it creates foreseeable boundary and conflict risks that require active mitigation. When immediate resolution is not possible, the BCBA should document safeguards, define boundaries, seek consultation, monitor risk, and develop a plan to eventually resolve the multiple relationship while minimizing disruption to needed services. The boundary shield moves from documentation and consultation to safeguards and monitoring, then to a feasible resolution plan. A. Waiting for actual harm ignores a foreseeable conflict and exploitation risks that should be addressed prospectively. C. Recusal may be one safeguard, but an undocumented informal agreement is not a complete risk management process. D. Immediate transfer may create an access harm and skips analysis of whether documented safeguards can manage the risk. Unavoidable now does not mean indefinite. Use documented safeguards and a feasible plan to resolve the overlap while protecting continuity of care. We now enter assessment, beginning with a common error, treating preference as permanent reinforcement. The stem gives 3 stages. Music is preferred. It initially functions as a reinforcer, and its effect later weakens after extended access. The answer must preserve all 3 without treating value as permanent. Question 17. Music is chosen first on most MSWO preference arrays. Later, when music is delivered for a target response, responding rises above the control condition during the first block. After prolonged access to music, responding falls back to control levels. What conclusion is best supported? A. The later response decline demonstrates punishment because responding decreased relative to the first block. B. The preference assessment is invalid because a valid preferred item must sustain reinforcement across all blocks. C. Music should be classified as a reinforcer across conditions because any initial increase establishes a permanent stimulus function. D. Music was preferred and functioned as a reinforcer initially. The later loss of effect may reflect changed motivating conditions. Separate what selection proves, what the contingent increase proves, and what prolonged access may change. Choose the answer that requires the fewest unsupported assumptions. The changing value of the item makes D the complete analysis. Music was preferred and functioned as a reinforcer initially. The later loss of effect may reflect changed motivating conditions. Selection establishes preference. The initial contingent increase demonstrates reinforcement under those conditions, and prolonged access can alter current value. The two assessments answered different questions. Music was preferred, and the initial experimental increase shows a reinforcing effect. The later decline limits generality and suggests a possible abolishing operation. The value meter moves from preferred to initial reinforcement to prolonged access and then to a lower current effect. A decline from the first block to control levels does not show suppression below an appropriate comparison caused by contingent music. B. A preference assessment can be valid even when reinforcing effectiveness changes with access, response effort, schedule, or context. C. Reinforcement is a functional relation under specified conditions, not an immutable property established forever by one block. Separate preference, demonstrated reinforcement, and the motivating conditions that can change a reinforcer's current effectiveness. The next assessment item separates a useful hypothesis from a causal conclusion. The observed sequence supports a functional hypothesis, but break and attention occur together. Because the variables have not been isolated, the data do not yet prove which consequence maintains aggression. Question 18. During ABC observations, aggression often follows difficult demands and is usually followed by a break. Attention is also frequently delivered during those breaks. Before choosing treatment, what can the BCBA reasonably conclude from these observations? A. Prioritize an escape treatment because the repeated demand-aggression break sequence is sufficiently function-specific. B. Classify the behavior as multiply-controlled unless a later assessment rules out either observed consequence. C. Prioritize an attention treatment because attention repeatedly follows aggression during the break. D. The pattern suggests hypotheses, but function is not yet established. Breaks and attention both follow aggression in the natural environment, so ask what has actually been isolated. Hold on to the decisive clue as you select your answer. Because descriptive covariance does not isolate function, choose D. The pattern suggests hypotheses, but function is not yet established. The data are correlational and two consequences covary in the natural context. Descriptive data can generate hypotheses, but they do not isolate variables. The covariation of breaks and attention makes a definitive functional claim premature. The causality gap graphic places the observed sequence on the left and a large not equal sign before function proved. A. The sequence supports an escape hypothesis, but descriptive covariation does not isolate the break from attention or establish causation. B. Two correlated consequences justify competing hypotheses, not a default conclusion of multiple control. C. Attention supports a second hypothesis, but its occurrence within breaks does not show that it independently reinforces aggression. Natural ABC patterns generate hypotheses. Isolated manipulation or converging evidence is needed for stronger causal conclusions. Sometimes assessment must proceed on two coordinated tracks rather than waiting for one discipline to finish. The sudden onset occurs alongside a medication change, poor sleep, and ear pulling. Those health indicators change the priority while behavioral observation and existing safety procedures can continue. Question 19. A client with no history of self-injury begins hitting the side of the head soon after a medication change. Sleep is disrupted, and the client is also pulling at an ear. Current protective procedures can be used safely while providers coordinate. What should the BCBA prioritize first? A. Protect safety and coordinate prompt medical evaluation while gathering ABC, sleep, and medication information. B. Contact the prescriber immediately and postpone behavioral observation until the medication response is known. C. Use protective equipment and collect 2 days of structured data before referral unless the behavior worsens. D. Conduct a brief latency functional analysis with medical support available before treating the health variables as relevant. Sudden onset plus medication, sleep, and ear-pulling indicators changes the priority before any functional label is chosen. Take a moment to choose from the 4 options on screen. The medical indicators and sudden onset make it the priority, Protect safety and coordinate prompt medical evaluation while gathering ABC, sleep, and medication information. Sudden onset, medication change, sleep disruption, and ear pulling indicate a possible medical variable and immediate safety concern. The BCBA should protect the client, facilitate prompt medical evaluation, and gather relevant behavioral information in parallel. Neither assessment lane should unnecessarily delay the other. The parallel response diagram keeps medical evaluation and behavioral data collection moving together. B. Prompt medical contact is appropriate, but safe behavioral observation can continue and may provide useful coordinated information. C. Protective procedures and structured data are appropriate, but the health indicators do not justify a fixed delay before referral. D. Experimental assessment may later be considered, but should not precede safety action and medical coordination when new health indicators are present. Sudden behavior change plus health indicators calls for safety and referral, not a topography-based functional guess. Assessment also includes deciding which goals are valuable enough to pursue. The client has identified a meaningful communication goal and has rejected an unnecessary response form. The decision is about social significance and client value, not about which behavior looks more typical. Question 20. A parent requests a goal requiring sustained eye contact in every conversation. The adolescent says eye contact is uncomfortable but wants help starting conversations and asking follow-up questions. There is no safety concern. Which goal should the BCBA prioritize? A. Prioritize gradual eye contact tolerance because the caregiver identifies it as a prerequisite for successful conversation. B. Complete a functional assessment of eye contact avoidance before beginning any social communication goal. C. Prioritize client-informed functional conversation goals and evaluate their social validity. D. Alternate eye contact and conversation goals, then retain whichever produces faster acquisition in baseline teaching probes. The client has named a meaningful communication outcome and rejected an unnecessary response form, with no safety reason to override that choice. Pause on the choices and commit to the best supported answer. Client value and functional significance supports C. Prioritize client-informed functional conversation goals and evaluate their social validity. The client identifies a meaningful functional goal and a concern about the requested response, with no safety reason to override that preference. Assessment and goal selection should be client-informed, culturally responsive, socially significant, and functionally useful. Conversation initiation and follow-up questions can meet the stated need without imposing unnecessary eye contact. On the priority scale, the client-chosen conversation skill outweighs the unsupported eye contact prerequisite. A. Caregiver input matters, but the STEM provides no evidence that sustained eye contact is a necessary prerequisite or worth the stated discomfort. B. Assessment may clarify variables, but a functional analysis of avoidance is not required before selecting the meaningful skills the client requested. D. Acquisition speed does not establish client value or social validity and does not justify imposing the more uncomfortable response. Choose goals for client value and functional significance, then make those goals measurable. Treatment selection begins with matching the procedure to the distribution of responding. The teacher is not setting one total for the whole lesson and is not requiring spacing between individual questions. The criterion is a separate count ceiling inside each 5-minute segment. Question 21. During a 20-minute lesson, a student asks 18 relevant questions. 8 occur in the first 5 minutes, followed by long periods of silence. The teacher wants no more than 2 questions in each 5-minute segment. The 2 questions may occur close together. No minimum time between them is required. Which contingency directly matches this goal? A. Deliver a reinforcer when the 20-minute total is 8 or fewer, regardless of when the questions occur. B. Deliver a token after each 5-minute segment with no more than 2 questions, then exchange tokens at lesson end. C. Reinforce a question only when at least 3 minutes have passed since the previous question. D. Deliver a token after each 5-minute segment in which no questions occur. The criterion is a count ceiling inside every 5-minute segment, while short inter-response times remain acceptable. Use that distinction to make your choice before the reveal. The segment-by-segment criterion identifies B. Deliver a token after each 5-minute segment with no more than 2 questions, then exchange tokens at lesson end. Success is defined by a response count ceiling within every 5-minute segment, while closed-together responses remain acceptable. That specifies interval DRL rather than whole session or spaced responding DRL. A separate low-rate criterion in each 5-minute segment is an interval DRL arrangement. It directly matches the local count criterion without adding a minimum spacing requirement. The 4 5-minute boxes are scored separately, each with a ceiling of 2 questions. A whole session total can still be met after an early burst and therefore does not directly distribute responding across segments. C. A spaced responding DRL imposes a minimum time between individual responses, but the stem explicitly allows 2 questions to occur close together. D. Requiring 0 questions is DRO and conflicts with the goal of allowing appropriate questions at a reduced rate. Match DRL to the pattern being changed, full session totals, local interval counts, or spacing between responses. The next procedure question uses learner data to choose how prompts should fade. The time delay route is producing many errors, while a smaller immediate prompt preserves accuracy. The next step should fade the successful prompt dimension rather than insist on the unsuccessful one. Question 22. A learner labels pictures with 100% accuracy after an immediate full word model. When the full model is delayed for 2 seconds, accuracy falls to 35% and errors increase. When only the first sound is given immediately, accuracy remains at 90%. What should the BCBA do next to transfer control to the picture while limiting errors? A. Continue increasing the delay to the full word model because longer delays necessarily strengthen picture control. B. Systematically fade the magnitude or content of the partial phonemic prompt while differentially reinforcing unprompted picture-controlled labels. C. Gradually reduce the size and contrast of the picture while retaining the immediate full word model. D. Keep the full word model immediate and thin reinforcement equally for prompted and independent responses. Time delay is producing many errors, while a smaller partial prompt preserves accuracy and can be reduced further. Now select the option that fits every part of the stem. The learner's prompt fading data support B. Systematically fade the magnitude or content of the partial phonemic prompt while differentially reinforcing unprompted picture-controlled labels. The time delay probe produces many errors, while a less intrusive partial prompt maintains high accuracy and can be faded in magnitude or content toward unprompted picture-controlled responding. The data support fading the magnitude or content of the successful partial prompt rather than extending a delay that currently produces many errors. Differentially reinforce unprompted labels under picture control as the partial prompt is reduced. The prompt fade graphic descends from full word accuracy to a partial initial phoneme prompt, and finally to independent picture control. A. The learner's current delay data shows substantial errors. Increasing delay without adjusting the support is not justified merely because delay can sometimes transfer control. C. Fading the natural picture while preserving the strongest verbal prompt moves control away from the intended stimulus. D. Changing reinforcement density without changing the controlling antecedent prompt does not directly transfer stimulus control. Select the fading dimension from learner data. Reduce prompt intrusiveness while preserving accuracy and strengthening unprompted responding under the natural stimulus. Procedure names become clearer when we ask whether we are building a sequence or refining one response form. Hand washing contains different responses that must occur in order. Saying then closer versions of milk, changes the form of one response. The procedure names should match those two structures. Question 23. A learner can perform every hand-washing step when each step is prompted, but cannot complete the full sequence independently. For a separate speech target, the learner says M and will be reinforced for closer versions of the word milk. Which teaching plan correctly matches each response pattern? A. Use forward chaining for hand-washing and backward chaining for the successive vocal approximations. B. Shape longer independent portions of hand-washing and use total task chaining for the speech target. C. Use total task chaining with prompt fading for hand-washing and shape the vocal response toward milk. D. Use backward chaining for both because each program ends with a terminal response. Compare the hand-washing components with the approximations M, me, and milk. Choose the answer that requires the fewest unsupported assumptions. Sequence versus response form makes C the correct pairing. Use total task chaining with prompt fading for hand-washing and shape the vocal response toward milk. Hand-washing is an ordered sequence of already available component responses. Milk is one response form refined through successive approximations. Total task chaining can organize and fade support across the known hand-washing sequence, whereas shaping changes the form of the single vocal response through successive approximations. The structure test places the ordered chain on one side and expanding approximations on the other. A. The hand-washing procedure is plausible, but progressively closer pronunciations are not an ordered chain of different component responses. B. Total task fits the established hand-washing analysis, but closer pronunciations are shaping, not a response chain. D. Backward chaining could apply to hand-washing, but a series of closer pronunciations remains shaping rather than chaining. Sequence of component responses points to chaining. Closer versions of one response point to shaping. Group contingencies can contain more than one programmed outcome at the same time. The break is controlled by each student's own performance. The music is controlled by the performance of one selected student, but is delivered to the whole class, so the outcomes must be classified separately. Question 24. During study period, any student who completes 12 problems accurately earns an individual break. After the period, one student is selected at random. If that student met the criterion, the whole class earns music time. How should these two outcomes be classified? A. Layered. Independent contingencies for the individual breaks plus a dependent group contingency for music. B. Layered. Independent contingencies for the breaks plus an interdependent group contingency because everyone receives music. C. Layered. Dependent contingencies for both outcomes because one randomly selected student controls the class reward. D. A single dependent group contingency. The individual breaks do not create a separate contingency type. Classify the break and the music separately by whose performance controls each outcome. Hold onto the decisive clue as you select your answer. Classifying each outcome separately leads to A. Layered. Independent contingencies for the individual breaks plus a dependent group contingency for music. Each student's own performance controls that students break, while one selected student's performance controls a shared class outcome. The individual breaks are independent because each student earns an outcome from that student's own performance. The music outcome is dependent because one selected member's performance determines the outcome for the whole group. The layered outcomes diagram shows 3 students earning their own breaks, then adds one selected student whose performance produces the shared class bonus. B. A shared reward is not automatically interdependent. Here the group outcome depends on one selected student rather than a group criterion. C. The selected student controls only the class music outcome, not the individual breaks earned separately by each student. D. The dependent group bonus does not erase the separately programmed independent contingencies for individual breaks. Classify each programmed outcome separately by whose performance controls it. Shared delivery alone does not determine the group contingency type. A strong intervention answer must now integrate function with what the real team can implement safely. The plan must address escape and use the break request the client already has. It must also fit what staff can deliver safely now while building the skills needed for more intensive procedures. Question 25. A client frequently refuses difficult tasks to escape the work. The client has learned to request a break with a picture card. Staff can honor the request, make small demand adjustments, and reinforce card use. However, staff are not yet trained to maintain demands safely during prolonged refusal. What should the BCBA include in the initial plan? A. Add coached escape extinction immediately because direct function match should take priority while staff skills develop. B. Begin break request training with graded demand adjustments. Train staff and measure integrity before considering more intensive components. C. Use task completion tokens now and practice the break card only during easier activities that staff can manage consistently. D. Focus first on intensive staff training and postpone direct treatment until the complete package can be implemented with high integrity. Look for the plan that addresses escape, uses the existing break request, and fits current staff capacity without postponing all benefit. Take a moment to choose from the 4 options on screen. Function, staff capacity, and integrity together support B. Begin break request training with graded demand adjustments. Train staff and measure integrity before considering more intensive components. The plan must address escape, use an available alternative response, fit current staff capacity, and reduce implementation risk. The staged function-based option uses the available functionally equivalent response, builds staff capacity, adjusts task difficulty, and measures implementation before considering a component that current staff cannot yet deliver safely. The fit equation adds escape function, the break card, staff capacity, and integrity monitoring. A. Escape extinction is function-related, but immediate use is premature when the STEM identifies current safety and integrity limits. C. Reliable token delivery does not replace teaching the available functionally equivalent response under the difficult task conditions where is needed. D. Staff training is necessary, but postponing the feasible communication and demand adjustment components delays an available function-based benefit. The best intervention answer must fit function, evidence, client needs, implementation capacity, and risk, not just one of those variables. Once a plan is chosen, the objective must preserve both the intended response and the conditions for generalization. The response is not just any coping behavior, it is an independent functional request. A complete objective also needs a measurable criterion and evidence of use across both task and staff changes. Question 26. The target coping skill is to request help or a short break independently when work exceeds the learner's current skill. The goal must separate independent requests from prompted requests. It must also show that the skill occurs with different tasks and different staff. Which objective measures the intended skill most completely? A. Independently request help or a 2-minute break within 30 seconds in 4 of 5 opportunities across 3 consecutive sessions. B. After staff says, use a coping skill, select help or break within 10 seconds in 80% of difficult task trials. C. Independently request help or a 2-minute break within 30 seconds in 80% of opportunities across 2 task types, 2 staff, and 3 consecutive sessions. D. Use an appropriate coping response when needed with at least 90% accuracy according to the supervising BCBA. Find the option that specifies independent requesting, timing, opportunities, and performance across tasks and implementers. Pause on the choices and commit to the best supported answer. The goal that preserves independence and generalization is C. Independently request help or a 2-minute break within 30 seconds in 80% of opportunities across 2 task types, 2 staff, and 3 consecutive sessions. The objective must name the intended request, score independence, define timing and opportunity-based performance, and require demonstration across both tasks and implementers. Option C preserves the functional request, excludes prompted responses, supplies a measurable criterion, and samples the skill across the 2 generalization dimensions specified in the STEM. The goal check graphic verifies independence, a 30-second timing window, 2 task types, and 2 staff members. A. This objective measures the correct independent response, but does not demonstrate the required generalization across task types and staff. B. The response follows a direct staff prompt, so the goal does not distinguish independent coping from prompted selection or test generalization. D. The response class, opportunity definition, timing, and scoring rule are too vague for reliable measurement. A strong goal preserves the intended response and specifies independence, opportunity, timing, criterion, and required generalization contexts. Before deciding that an intervention has failed, verify what intervention was actually delivered, unless safety requires an immediate change. The outcome worsens at the same time a critical function-based component is delivered less often, and no urgent safety issue requires a different plan first. The BCBA should repair delivery before declaring the intervention ineffective. Question 27. A function-based intervention reduces aggression at first. Over the next month, aggression rises again. During the same period, procedural integrity falls from 92% to 48%, especially for reinforcing the replacement response. No immediate safety issue requires a different protective response. What should the BCBA analyze or repair first? A. Address implementation barriers, safely restore and verify critical components, then re-evaluate outcomes before replacing the plan. B. Add response blocking while the current reinforcement schedule and staff supports remain unchanged. C. Conduct an abbreviated functional analysis before making any implementation changes. D. Compare high and low integrity sessions as they naturally occur before helping staff repair implementation. The outcome worsens as a critical function-based component drops sharply, and the STEM rules out an urgent safety reason to change course first. Use that distinction to make your choice before the reveal. The integrity drop must be repaired first, so choose A. Address implementation barriers, safely restore and verify critical components, then re-evaluate outcomes before replacing the plan. Outcome deterioration co-varies with a large drop in a critical function-based component, and no immediate safety issue requires the plan to be changed first. When no immediate safety issue requires a different response, low integrity prevents a clean conclusion about treatment efficacy. Address implementation barriers, safely restore and verify critical components, and then evaluate whether outcomes recover. The integrity link pairs the drop from 92 to 48% with aggression rising. B. Adding a protective component does not restore the missing function-based reinforcement or permit a clean efficacy conclusion. C. A new analysis may eventually be warranted, but the documented loss of a critical component is the more proximal rival explanation to test first. D. Waiting for naturally poor implementation prolongs a known quality problem. Repair integrity, then reassess outcomes. When safety does not require immediate modification and integrity has fallen, restore and verify critical components before concluding that the intervention itself is ineffective. Supervision begins where training room mastery fails to transfer into natural performance. The trainee has already demonstrated the skill in training. The remaining problem appears when natural cues and workflow change, so the next step must build transfer to the real unit. Question 28. After instruction, modeling, role play, and feedback, a trainee performs a prompting procedure with 100% integrity in the training room. On the busy unit, integrity falls to 60%. Errors are most common when materials are stored differently or interruptions occur. What should the supervisor do next? A. Arrange in situ rehearsal and feedback under varied unit conditions and program common cues and materials. B. Add a knowledge quiz and require 90% before the trainee returns to the unit. C. Provide end-of-week graph feedback while leaving unit materials and practice conditions unchanged. D. Repeat the written instruction and modeling in the training room until performance is overlearned. Role play is already accurate, so locate the missing bridge between practice and the busy unit. Now select the option that fits every part of the STEM. Training room mastery with natural setting failure points to A. Arrange in-situ rehearsal and feedback under varied unit conditions and program common cues and materials. The skill occurs in role play, but not under natural unit stimuli, so the deficit is generalization and contextual performance rather than missing initial BST components. In-situ practice with feedback, varied exemplars, and common stimuli extends the already acquired performance to the setting in which it must occur. The transfer bridge starts with 100% training room performance and carries the skill across shared cues into the busy unit. B. A knowledge criterion does not reproduce the interruptions, cues, or material arrangement controlling unit performance. C. Delayed outcome feedback may help monitoring, but it omits supported practice and leaves the contextual mismatches unchanged. D. The trainee already demonstrates mastery in that setting. More training room exposure does not target the transfer failure. When BST performance is strong only in training, program generalization with in-situ practice, varied examples, and common stimuli. Not every workplace performance problem is a training deficit. Staff have shown that they can perform the procedure. Missing materials and conflicting expectations are blocking performance, which makes this a system problem before it is a retraining problem. Question 29. Staff can accurately explain and demonstrate a data collection procedure during supervision. On the unit, however, the correct forms are often missing and different shifts give conflicting expectations. Data completion is low. What should the supervisor address first? A. Temporarily use staff recall at shift and so treatment data can continue while the system is reviewed. B. Run a brief booster training and compare completion before changing the unit system. C. Add individual feedback and a completion incentive while leaving forms and shift expectations unchanged. D. Fix materials and expectations before assuming a skill deficit. Staff can describe and demonstrate the procedure, so examine the materials and expectations that block performance outside supervision. Choose the answer that requires the fewest unsupported assumptions. Demonstrated skill plus system barriers makes D the answer. Fix materials and expectations before assuming a skill deficit. The staff demonstrate the skill under supervision, while missing materials and conflicting expectations obstruct workplace performance. The evidence points to antecedent and systems barriers rather than an acquisition deficit. The supervisor should make correct performance possible and clear, then monitor the effect. The performance diagnosis map moves from demonstrated skill to missing forms and conflicting expectations, then to fix the system before retraining. A. Recall-based recording changes measurement quality and works around rather than first correcting the documented system barriers. B. A booster can refresh the skill, but staff already demonstrate it, and the identified antecedent barriers would remain. C. Consequences may influence performance, but they cannot make unavailable forms accessible or clarify incompatible expectations. Can do, but does not do suggests a performance environment problem. Cannot do suggests a skill problem. We finish with feedback that is specific enough to change the next performance. The overall score hides one repeated error in a critical timing step. Improving outcomes do not authorize the supervisee to change the protocol, so feedback should name, rehearse, and verify that specific correction. Question 30. A supervisee completes 9 of 10 teaching steps correctly, but repeatedly prompts before the required 5-second delay. Client accuracy is improving, so the supervisee says the timing difference does not matter. Which feedback would best correct the performance? A. Client accuracy is improving, so the 90% integrity score is sufficient and no change is needed. B. Review the full protocol independently and address the timing issue in next month's evaluation. C. Shorten the written delay to match your current performance because outcome data are improving. D. Instruction and reinforcement were accurate. The prompt was early. Rehearse the 5-second delay and measure the next trials. One critical timing step is drifting, and improving client accuracy does not authorize an unreviewed protocol change. Hold onto the decisive clue as you select your answer. Specific feedback with rehearsal and verification is D. Instruction and reinforcement were accurate. The prompt was early. Rehearse the 5-second delay and measure the next trials. One critical step is repeatedly implemented differently from the protocol, and improving outcome data do not by themselves establish that the deviation is acceptable. The selected feedback acknowledges accurate components, names the observable deviation, requires immediate rehearsal, and plans direct measurement of the corrected performance. The feedback loop follows 4 actions: acknowledge what worked, name the early prompt, rehearse the 5-second delay, and measure the next trials. A total integrity score and improving client data do not justify ignoring a consistently altered critical step. B. Delayed, broad review misses an immediate opportunity to correct and verify the specific performance. C. Changing the protocol to fit drift is premature without analysis and authorization of the modification. Effective feedback identifies what worked, names the observable change, and creates a near-term opportunity to practice it. Across all 30 questions, 4 transfer moves keep recurring. Prefer evidence over attractive labels. Analyze function and controlling relations rather than surface form. Assess missing information, medical variables, integrity, or system barriers before escalating. And let context, client values, risk, competence, capacity, and generalization change the best answer when it should. Hard questions become manageable when we can say exactly what the STEM proves, what it only suggests, and what the tempting option would still need. Now turn each miss into a reusable decision rule. Use our free mock exam to identify weak domains. Then use our BCBA 6th edition quick study guide to rebuild the concepts behind those misses. The direct links are https://www.bcbamockexam.com/free-bcba-mock-exam and https://www.bcbamockexam.com/bcba-6th-edition-study-guide/. Do not memorize the answer letters from this set. Practice finding the decisive evidence, naming the relation it establishes, and explaining why the nearest alternative fails. That is the skill these 30 hard questions were built to train.